But welcome to Taking the Tradition On. And here we are in the fifth series, and this series is Soul Stories. Each month, I am inviting an eminent, well-respected, interesting, and fantastic storyteller to come and share one of their soul stories, a story that has travelled with them as they have made their journey as a storyteller. One of those stories that has just wrapped themselves around them, got lodged in their heart and become part of them, that has changed with them as they grow, and to talk about what that story means to them and why it has become so important. So it's always fascinating, always incredibly different. As usual, it will be a little bit of storytelling, but it's not a performance. Taking the Tradition is about taking the tradition on, about challenging it, and about how we take it forward. And it is discussion. So we'd like you to get involved in the discussion as well. Please make comments on the chat, put questions in. So I'll be taking questions from the audience as we go. Sometimes we're just in the flow and I can't take people's questions, and so we'll have a Q&A with lots more questions at the end. So my guest tonight, actually I should do a few thank yous first, because things like this never happen on my own. I always have an amazing guest to thank, but this is all made possible by my amazing patrons. I've got a group of dedicated, loyal, wonderful people who contribute a little bit every month to make this happen, to help create this space where we can have these conversations. And if you'd like to join them, you'd be very welcome, but there is no pressure. But they help keep this free to everybody, both tonight and also so that we can keep the archive of all previous conversations up on YouTube. So if you're new to Taking the Tradition On, there's a whole wealth of conversations on all sorts of different topics with all sorts of storytellers that you can go and explore on the YouTube site, Taking the Tradition On. But tonight we are here with a consummate performer. She is vivacious, she's dynamic, she's spontaneous. She's not just a storyteller, she combines all sorts of skills. She brings together storytelling, music, street theatre, sometimes even a little bit of dance, improvisation, everything to create amazing, spontaneous, responsive performances. And live is where she is best. She's also a proud autist and mother of 3 autists, and that I think is going to impact quite heavily on her soul story tonight, which is the Wild Man of Orford. So please put your virtual hands together, go wild on the chat for the incredible storyteller and my guest tonight, Justine de Mierre.
Thank you.
Welcome, Justine.
Can you introduce me like every time I do a performance with all of that? That would just be really lovely.
That'd be great. I can come and be your roadie.
Yeah, my hype woman. That's what I need.
I'm really happy to do that. I would guess. I'll
Cool.
be there. I'll be like, I have to think of like lots of darts nicknames for you, like
Yeah.
the jump in, Justine, the jubilant, anyway. I'm gonna work more on that. I'll get my darts.
Someone once told me when I introduce at festivals, I introduce folk musicians like they're wrestlers. I'm quite proud of that.
But wrestlers and darts players do get the best introductions, actually, apart from snooker players, which is amazing because you get these incredible introductions.
Yeah.
And then it's very quiet for the rest of the thing.
I know.
We can do the big introduction, but we're not going to be very quiet for the rest of the evening. I think that is a given.
Yes.
So I am going to ask you in a little bit to tell your story so that we all know what you're talking about. We'd love to hear the story.
Yeah.
But you come from a part of the world that I have to confess I don't know very well at all. And it's where your story's based as well. So and I think that's part of the soul story aspect of your story, because your landscape is one that, I mean, you've traveled away from, but it's always drawn you back, and it's a real part of you and your storytelling, because you live in Suffolk, don't you?
I do. I live in Suffolk, which is kind of, I would say, for people that don't know England, it's the bump on the side, and we're the bottom bit of the bump. So it's sort of, if you think of that, it's like the kind of the mirror bit of Wales, it's kind of, we're the other side of it, except we're not a country. We kind of think we are as Eastern Angles, but we're kind of, but it's, I mean, I think we moved to Suffolk when I was about 5 months old, I think. And then I lived in Leiston, and then when I was very little, and then to Beccles, and then kind of moved away and then moved back to Woodbridge. So, and it's interesting actually because this story is based on rivers, and I've always lived on rivers. I don't feel comfortable unless I'm near a river. So, yeah, and then actually others of my stories are on kind of normally on those dividing rivers as well that kind of separate counties or land and sea. Yeah, but I mean, I love Suffolk, and that's, I guess, what's drawn me back here. It's a very kind of flat landscape, and the skies are so wide. That's what I love about it. That kind of it just feels like this endless possibility of these huge open skies. When I drive over the Orwell Bridge, which is about 10 miles from here, it just feels like you're flying. You can't actually see land. You just see this huge sky, which is amazing. Yeah, so it's kind of it means a lot, and I guess that's why I come back here and why a lot of my stories are either here or inspired by this kind of landscape, this kind of, sort of very kind of flat land with kind of these big open skies. Feels like, I don't know, feels like very me.
I would go with that. I can see sort of the opening out and,
Mm,
and the big vistas.
yeah.
So I think we'd all like to. I just want to sit back and listen now because we're going to be talking about this story. But should we just sink into it first?
Yes, let me
Um,
take a sip of water. You know when you're about to tell and your throat just goes, no.
well, take a breath, take a drink, and then we're all going to just sit back and relax for the Wild Man of Orford.
So it's the year 1167, and Bill, the oldest of the fishermen, he's stood at the end of the quay in Orford, and he looks out to sea, and there's a mist on the sea, and he says, "That's a rum all morning out there." And all the other fishermen are further down the quay, and they look at him and they go, "What are you on about, Bill? Get in your boat." And Billy turns away from the sea and he goes and he gets in his fishing boat. And his boat and a couple of the other boats, they go out. And they go out past the spit at Orford Ness and they go out onto the fishing grounds. And as is the time-honoured tradition, they take their nets, they whirl them around, they throw them, and they wait whatever the time-honoured time is. And Bill pulls in the first catch and not quite enough in there, So he says, "We'll put it out again, boys." And he takes that net and they throw it out to sea and they wait and they wait. And then haul it in again, but still not quite enough fish for the day. So Bill says, "One more time, boys." And they take that net and they throw it out and they wait and they wait and they wait. And this time when they start to haul it in, they can feel the weight in the net. And they heave and they heave and they heave. And everyone on the boat is pulling it in and they're pulling it over their backs like that until they let the catch drop in the bottom of the boat. And then they turn around to see what they got and they go, "What's that?" Because there, in the bottom of the boat, is a man. A man with absolutely no hair on his head and a huge long beard and hair all over his body. And he's just lying in the bottom of the boat, looking up at them. And all the fishermen are looking down at him. And then everyone looks at Bill. And Bill looks at them, looks down at the man and says, "That's what we caught. That's what we're taking home." And so they cover the wild man in a sailcloth and they set sail back for Orford Quay. They're the last boat back in. So the villagers are already around, kind of looking at the catch that's come in. And they see Bill's boat coming in behind the others. And they see that his catch is covered in a sailcloth. And they shout out to him, "What you got in there, Bill?" Bill says, "You'll see." And he pulls up the boat alongside the quay. And all the villagers stand and look over. And then he pulls back the sailcloth. And to a man, they go, "What the heck's that?" Because the man's just still lying there in the bottom of the boat, blinking at them. Well, one of the fishermen helps him to his feet, helps him step out of the boat. And when he gets onto the land, he shuffles like this, one foot in front of another, which makes it really hard to go up those stone steps. And then he shuffles his way onto the quay, and all the villagers of Orford all stand around him. And no one really knows what to say. Then one of the villagers says, "What's your name?" The wild man just stares. And then another one says, "Where'd you come from?" The wild man just stares back at them. And then a whisper goes around. Someone says, "Well, maybe he's hungry, but all they've got is fish." So one of the villagers takes a fish, throws it up in the air, and the wild man catches it, squeezes all of the juice and all of the blood out of it, and then eats it in one gulp. And the villagers stand back and they look at Bill, and someone says, "Well, what are we going to do with him?" And then Bill says, "Well, he was caught on the governor's land, so we better take him to the governor." Now, the governor is what they call the person that Henry II left in charge of Orford Castle, one Bartholomew de Glanville, a knight of the realm whose job it is to look after this part of Suffolk and that castle in particular. So the wild man shuffles along, and the villagers walk along behind him, and they walk all the way from the quay until they get to the castle wall. And when they get to the castle wall, which isn't there anymore but was, it has a huge oak door, and they knock on the door. This is hard to do on Zoom, but imagine. And the door opens, and a guard goes, "Yeah, what do you want?" And Bill says, "We got this here wild man. Thought the governor might like to see him. He's caught on his lands." Guard says, "All right, then come in." And Bill comes in, and the wild man shuffles, and all of the villagers, and they walk through the castle grounds until they get to the really narrow steps up to the keep. They're still there. You can still visit. He shuffles his way up, and they knock on the door of the keep. And another guard opens. "What do you want?" He's the brother of the other one. He says, the guard, the previous one says, "They've got a wild man. They want to show him to the governor." Guard says, "I'll go and ask him." So the second guard goes into the round room at Orford. You can still go there. And Bartholomew de Glanville is sat on a very throne-like chair. He says, "Yeah, what is it?" Guard says, "There's some villagers. They've got some wild man they want to show you." He goes, "Ah, lovely. I was getting terribly bored. Show them in." And so the villagers shuffle into that round room, and they go around the edges, and they sort of push the wild man into the middle. And the wild man stares, looks around. And so Bartholomew Glanville asks him, "So what's your name?" And the wild man just stares. And de Glanville says, where do you come from?" And the wild man, he just stares. So de Glanville says to the villagers, what does he do anything?" And one of the villagers has, thankfully, brought a fish with him. So they throw the fish up, and the wild man catches it and squeezes out all of the juice and all of the blood until it's just flesh and bones, and eats it in one gulp. And de Glanville says, "That is awfully entertaining. Thank you so much. I will keep him." Off you all go. And off they go. The villagers head out of the castle, and the wild man begins his life at the castle. And de Glanville lets him have the run of the castle. He can go up to the top where the ramparts are and look out to the sea from where he came. He's allowed in that round room, that main chamber where de Glanville lives. Well, they put a couch for him, a lovely, like a chaise longue where he sleeps. And he's allowed down into the kitchens below where they cook the food. He can go wherever he wants. And de Glanville is glad of the unusual company, guessing there wasn't a lot to do in Suffolk at the time. And although de Glanville is pleased, the servants less so. They meet in the tavern at night. And the maid who cleans the floor says, "Oh, you wouldn't believe it. I was cleaning the floor the other day, right? And I'd just got scrubbing it, and he comes along with his shuffling feet, knocks over that bucket of dirty water. I got to start all over again." And the cook says, "Oh, same for me. I was downstairs, I was cooking the master's dinner. I had like a steak out, you know. He comes, raw meat, squeezes the blood out of it, eats it one go. I've got to start again." And then one of the servants, and no one's quite sure who, says, "Well, it's not right, is it? I mean, if he can't speak, then he can't say his prayers. And if he can't say his prayers, then he's not a God's work and he shouldn't be in a castle that belongs to the king. And you know what it's like when someone starts putting doubt in your mind. And that goes round all of the servants, but none of them dare say or do anything while de Glanville is there. They know he's under de Glanville's protection. But of course, the man of the king, every now and again, he has to go to London to see the king. And the very next time that he's gone, and the wild man is asleep on his couch, the servants come and they pull him from the couch in the night and they tie him to a chair and they start demanding of him, "What's your name? Where do you come from? Say your prayers." And the wild man just looks at them. And so they carry on, "What's your name? Where do you come from? Say your prayers. Who are you?" But of course, the wild man says nothing. And the more he says nothing, the more annoyed they get with him and they start beating him and they're beating him and they're demanding, "Who are you? Where do you come from? Say your prayers." In the night when they can get nothing out of him, they put him in the dungeon. If you ever go to Orford Castle, there is a very tiny gift shop and that is where the dungeon is. It's just enough room for one human underneath a trapdoor in the floor. The next day, they take him out again. They take him out into the grounds and they tie him to a tree and they start again. "What's your name? Where do you come from? You say your prayers now." And they carry on until de Glanville comes home and sees them. "What on earth are you doing? Get him down there immediately." And one of the servants finally gets the courage up to say, "Well, the thing is, your worship, your lordship, that's not right, is it? I mean, if he can't say his prayers and he's not the God's work, he shouldn't be in God's castle, in the king's castle." And de Glanville says, "Oh, for goodness sake. Is that all it is? Look, I tell you what we'll do. Tomorrow we'll take him to church, we'll take him to St. Matthew's, and he can sit there like all of God's creatures, and then hopefully you'll be happy. Now, for goodness sake, someone tend to his wounds." And so some of the servants reluctantly take him down, take him to his couch, tend to his wounds. And the very next day, he is taken from the castle with de Glanville's party and walk all the way through Orford to St. Matthew's. And the wild man watches what everyone else is doing and shuffles his way in and makes his way into one of the pews and sits down with de Glanville's party. And he looks around. And after a little bit of waiting, the priest arrives. And he goes up into the pulpit and he starts delivering his sermon. He says, "Dearly beloved, we are gathered here today." And I'll be honest with you, it's the most boring sermon that anyone has ever heard, ever. And every single person in that church wishes they could walk out, but they just sit there and they nod politely because they know that they have to do that. But the wild man, he doesn't. He does what everyone else wants to do. He stands up, he shuffles his way out, and he makes his way back to the castle. Well, the servants petitioned de Glanville. So you see what happened in the church? That's not right in being in the castle. De Glanville feels he has to make some compromise. So he said, "All right, then what we'll do is we'll get those fishermen that found him. They will make a lovely enclosure and we'll sink it into the moat. And then he can swim in the moat. We know he likes the water. He'll be fine there. And he'll be nearby for me." The servants reluctantly agree. But that's what happens. A big old enclosure is made with nets and it's sunk into the moat. So you wouldn't know it was there. But the idea is to stop him getting out. He has kind of like a swimming pool, I guess. And he's taken down to the moat and he's shown the water. And he looks at it. And he looks at de Glanville. And de Glanville says, "It's just we thought you might like water instead of being up on land with us. So if you jump in and then I'll pop down and see you later." And so the wild man dives into the water. And he swims backwards and forwards for a bit, surfacing and going underneath, until the servants, as satisfied as they will be, drift back to the castle. And de Glanville says, "Well, I'll pop down and see you later. Enjoy." And once everyone is out of sight, the wild man disappears underneath the water, and he's never seen there again. Somehow he escapes that enclosure. The people of Orford, some of them say that after that he turned up months later in fishermen's nets. Sometimes people say that he even spent some time living with the fishermen. But what they all agree is that the very last time he was seen, they say he was stood on the end of the spit at Orford Ness, and he took one long look back to the castle and one long look out to sea, and then dived the most graceful dive, disappeared under the waves, and was never seen or heard from again. And there ends my tale. Thank you.
Oh, fantastic. And a very, very old story then. So yeah, fantastic.
Very, very old.
About 900 years it's set ago. It's got a very specific date.
Yeah, 1167 is the kind of specific date, and it's kind. I think the original, the sort of, it was written down about 50 years after it's supposed to have happened. So, and then kind of revisited by people since then. But there's kind of folk songs around it, and there's kind of manuscript from the time. So it's fascinating to kind of like pull together different storytellers' versions of it and different kind of things from the time, you know. But yeah, it's kind of, and I think everyone who kind of, a lot of people kind of say they don't tell it because they haven't managed to pull the strands together. But those of us that do kind of have different things that we found. So I think it's anyone that does tell it is like, it's quite a personal thing as to which strands you pull for you, I guess.
Well, and it is quite an unusual story, and I can imagine it's quite tricky for a lot of people to find their way
Yeah.
into it. And
Yeah.
yet for you, that's become one of those stories that is with you all the time. It's one of your soul stories. And
Yeah.
so how long, when did you first hear this story?
So I think as a kid growing up in Suffolk, I definitely heard, I don't think I heard the whole story, but the idea that there was a Wild Man of Orford. And actually growing up in Suffolk, he often gets confused with Green Man. And do you know what I mean? There's kind of like lots of those. But as a kid, we would, you know, we would go and visit Orford Castle. So I've definitely been there and read kind of the panels about it when I was little. But I guess it wasn't until there was a local school that actually commissioned me to tell it, which was great because it gave me a chance to kind of do proper research on it and get my feet on the ground in the castle. So yeah, and that I think that was about 10 years ago. So it's kind of, that was when I got to really dive into it, I guess. But it's always been that sort of the myth. There were lots of myths and stuff that sort of live in the back of your head, you know, if you grow up here.
And that's sort of quite close to the beginning of your storytelling journey as well, isn't it? Had you been storytelling long at that point?
Yeah, so I guess I first kind of called myself a professional storyteller in 2008, maybe, I guess. And it's really interesting. So how I became a storyteller is I'd everything I'd done had been about stories. Like when I was making interactive theatre for Ladge to the Moon was my company that I worked with in London. It was all about stories and it was always about telling stories of people. And then I went on a professional development kind of weekend with Oily Cart, who make amazing theatre for non-speaking people. And I met a storyteller. It's the first time I'd met a storyteller. And Catherine Holt, I think her name was. And I think the fact that she was similar to me made me think, oh, that's a thing I could be. You know? And then I was talking with another artist that I met on there, a visual artist called Emma Withers. Um, and I said, I really think I want to be a storyteller. And she said, that's great. I can pay you this much money to come and tell for this group of children. You know? But what's really interesting about that is that group of children was an autistic group of children. And one of them was her son, who was the person I first thought of as the wild man when I tell that story. So the kind of and I think that's, you know, like my journey with kind of realizing I was autistic, which is obviously a little way off then, is so wound up in my journey into storytelling. It's like they are there at the beginning together, you know, and that's really fascinating. But you can see why, even just from that, that's why this story, even this was before this story is in my repertoire, you know.
And that is yeah. So and autism has always been part of your journey as a storyteller. You've worked with autistic children and young people
Yeah.
right from the get-go, and that being part of your work even before you were a storyteller. Um,
Yeah, I mean, I worked with my first autist when I was like 14, who used to come to me for like piano lessons, and it was great because it was just one of the things that I love about autistic children is they're just kind of you just have to go with the flow. I mean, neurodivergent children generally, it's the same kind of with ADHD as well. Um, so it was just a really creative space. We had half an hour, and the kind of rough remit was we're going to make music, and sometimes we did, and sometimes we drew pictures. So that's kind of so I've been working, and it's really odd when you kind of think I've been working with autistic people that long, and kind of did life skill stuff, drama stuff, all the way kind of to working with kind of excluded kids in London. But it took that long for me to realize that I was autistic, which is funny. So you're so good with autistic people for like years and years ago. Oh, there'll be a reason for that. But
because
that's
it
not an
wasn't.
uncommon story, I think.
Well, because I think because people don't know. I mean, I'm assuming people listening to this won't know that you are autistic until I sort of told them at the beginning or when you found out. So it wasn't until 2019
Yeah.
that you actually got a diagnosis. I mean, had you had any inkling before that?
Yeah, so it's really interesting. So the first person my family diagnosed was my middle son, James, and that kind of came through school. And then it was only when my daughter was about 2 and people started to talk about it that I started to look into definitions of like female autism or female autistic experiences. And reading those, I just went, "Oh, well, that's me." It's like, that's kind of that's exactly my experience. Yeah, and I think it probably took about, as with most women, you kind of, most like diagnosed autistic women, you kind of go through. I don't want to take away from people that are really autistic. Do you know what I mean? You go through that journey of denying it, not denying it for any other reason other than you don't want to kind of take up resources for other people, to realizing that actually this is your space, to kind of then going, okay, so now I know I am, let me go down that diagnostic process. And that's really scary, that last bit, because it's normally for most people it's become a part of your identity. And it's kind of a validation, but also you have to kind of go into it knowing that even if you're not medically, that doesn't mean you're not. It's just a kind of it's kind of like, it's the icing on the cake, I guess, in a really rough kind of way.
Oh, I've got about 3 billion different questions to take us into different spaces that I want to ask all at the same time now. But I guess I want to take us back to the story. So you didn't know that you were autistic. You'd always known that this story's around. You got asked to tell it for this commission,
Yeah,
and uh, quite often when you're asked to do things, you don't necessarily have a particular connection with the story.
yeah.
Yeah, something in that clicked for you, and you were saying that was it just sort of straight away this 14-year-old boy, your friend's son, you just went, oh my days, this is him.
I
Did
think
you
no,
look at the story
actually, I
and go,
think
this for me is about autism?
I mean, I think it was actually more as I told the story, that's who I saw. Do you know what I mean? Because I can't remember how old he was at the time, maybe like 16 or something, I can't remember, but like really tall and really kind of strong and, loved to swim and just, you know, but I think it was, not just him, but other people that I'd known. I think I mean, stories of difference have always been my thing, and that's kind of, before I knew I was autistic. And I think it is almost like as a storyteller, you are drawn to the things that speak to you. So I have a kind of whole collection of stories that I call stories of otherness, they're always feeling slightly different. And then, my kind of connection with mermaids and the mermaid song piece and kind of other mermaid stories I have, that idea of being seeming something different to what you appear to be, like the surface is different to kind of what's on top. So I have had that relationship with these kind of water people for a really long time. Like even coming out of drama school, I just kept getting cast as mermaids. It was hilarious. It's just there was a panto, I was the mermaid. If there was it, I was the mermaid. Just, so this kind of idea of mer people and people that live in the water, again has just followed me, almost like it's like something's calling you and you just kind of it keeps coming until you go, oh, I get it. So yeah, I think that's why when I was kind of commissioned to do the Wild Man of Orford, it felt like, this is one of my people, and that's kind of really interesting. But I also kind of like in this story that he's not a mer person, that he doesn't have scales, that all of the things he has are human, that he's covered in hair, and he just happens to be in the water, and that feels really important, like this really different kind of human. Um, yeah, I've kind of gone. I can't remember what your question was now, but I just carried on.
That's fine. No, well, I'm not sure there was a question as such, but it's just circling around that story and kind of, because there's usually, I mean, it's same with, it's that fishing metaphor straight away, isn't it? There's usually a hook that
Yeah,
draws you in. And so it was about being someone different. And I
yeah,
suppose if you were looking at that, if you'd all, and that's what drew you in, is that the thing that you'd always felt different? And
yeah.
that's why you want to tell stories about being different.
Yeah, I think so. So I'd always felt different, but always been treated as if I was being difficult. Do you know what I mean? So I felt different, but I was treated as if I was being difficult or as being diva-like or didn't suffer fools gladly. And I never understood that. And I think some of my telling stories about difference because I didn't feel different on the inside. Do you know what I mean? I felt the same, but somehow the way that I was kind of presenting to the world was making people think different things about me to what was going on the inside. So something about stories was about trying to understand why I was perceived as different, I think. That's kind of, and sometimes I guess also seeking stories that justified and celebrated difference so you could kind of feel okay to be different. So yeah, I think it is that idea of difference, and I think as well certainly starting to kind of work on that story, there being a mystery about difference. One of the things that I like about the Wild Man of Orford is that there are unanswered questions and we don't know what's going on for him. We can look at it from the outside, but we can't actually know, and that feels really important to kind of to almost preserve like his voice because he chose not to kind of like share it for whatever reason. So it feels like just that what happens when we just look from the outside, and that is very much what happens in that story. It's just how other people perceive, which may be very different to what's going on inside. So I guess that's that was kind of the hook for me, that mystery about it as well. And it's really interesting. I mean, because I say when I was working on it, I went to Orford Castle and I stood. So I swear to God, there's a stain where that fish got squeezed. I don't know if I just made that, but I have taken kids there since they're gone. That's where we did it. And there's something about standing in that room where all of this is supposed to have happened, which feels, and that kind of circle, it's a real perfect circle. And as soon as you're standing in his feet, you feel it. You can kind of have that sense of that otherness in that time.
I think it's hilarious about the gift shop though. I feel like they're missing a trick. If the gift shop is that small, how on earth do they sell or stock anything? It must
It's
be the most
true.
claustrophobic gift shop in the world.
The thing is, it's above where the dungeon is. So that's the thing. It's like this little kind of sort of, it's not even as big as like your front hallway. Do you know what I mean? And they stack things on the shelves and like you have to turn around and kind of it's mostly just mead and trinkets, which is, why would anyone ever need anything else? But there is a little trapdoor in the floor, which presumably they use for stock, but that's where the dungeon is. It's just, yeah.
So we've leapt in here and you're talking sort of on a fairly deep level about autism. Now, I don't know how much people here know about autism. Now, I encounter people with autism and I encounter quite a lot of children with autism. And it's more around in everyday speech now, but it's just like there's an awful lot of kind of going,
Yeah.
well, yes, I'm going to introduce you to, I'm just going to warn you, he might be a bit on the spectrum. Um, like we're all on the spectrum. There's the whole point of a spectrum, and there is a very wide level of difference along that and similarity. I mean, being on the spectrum is kind of a really interesting phrase.
Yeah, and it's kind of so I mean it's really interesting thing about the spectrum because I think people misunderstand what it is. So actually the autistic spectrum doesn't include non-autistic people. So it's not a spectrum. So people interpret the autistic spectrum as a gradient and it's not. It's not a gradient from not autistic to really autistic. It's like a color wheel. Do you know what I mean? That has different kind of things in it, and you're somewhere in that. It's more like a ball, and you might be at some spot on it or somewhere in it, rather than rather than kind of rather than being everyone's in that spectrum. They're just not like autism is kind of a separate thing to not being autistic. It's kind of like so when I used to do stand up, I used to describe it as it's like saying like okay, so imagine you went out for a kebab one night and you were really drunk and you fell over and you twisted your ankle and you woke up the next morning and you felt really sick, right? So you would have morning sickness and you would have swollen ankles, but you wouldn't describe yourself as pregnant. So it's like, it's kind of, it's not about what's going on the outside. It's about what's going on in the inside. It requires the baby for those symptoms or signs to be a pregnancy thing, you know? And it's the same with autism. You kind of go, well, just because you might not, you know, you might not like, I can't think of a thing, but you know, it's really understanding that there's a great quote, and I wish I could remember who it's from, but she said that it's another autistic advocate. She said that the problem with autism, like in terms of its definitions, is that from the moment it was defined by other people's experience of it, as opposed to how it's experienced internally. And that's the issue. Like, you know, we're perceived as being, you know, oversensitive to things. But actually, we don't. You know, scientific research shows that we experience like 20% more sensory input than other people do. So I always say to people, like, imagine whatever you're experiencing was 20% more. What would you look like? You know, what would happen to you? And then you actually see that we're not oversensitive to something. We're reacting like humans do to things that are that extreme. And I think that's what people often forget with it, is this misconception that it is we experience the world the same, but we're more fussy about it, as opposed to oh yeah, someone's just said like the sliders on a synthesizer. Yes, I've seen that meme. um, yeah, it's like, you know, sometimes when I try to describe it to people, I'm like, if you, particularly if you've seen like a kid or an adult in meltdown, often I'd say to people, it's like, what would have to be going on for you to experience that, for you to be like that? And then think, okay, so that level of intensity that it would take for you as a non-autistic person is what that person's experiencing right then. And that's kind of really important to understand, because then you get away from this is a behavioral thing. It's not, it's a response to environment, you know.
Well, I'm going to take you back even another step, because you say, oh, I think people forget. I don't think people forget because you have to know something in the first place to
Yeah,
forget
yeah,
it. I think that actually there isn't that general level of understanding
yeah,
to forget that. I think so. You've given us some sort of insights, and I know this is a big ask because it's as Elaine's saying, there's kind of slides in different places and kind of the different ratios of autism, and it's a big topic.
yeah.
Could you give us like a very basic definition of what it actually is?
I think the most basic definition is it's a different way of perceiving the world, you know, like not by choice. So it's, you know, it's a different experience of being in the world. We are humans that experience the world differently, and therefore that impacts how we communicate about it. You know, so I mean, it's like they say it's kind of social communication and sensory differences. It's really hard to come up with that definition, but I guess what it is that our brains are different, and they are either more or less sensitive to the same kind of stimuli, if that makes sense. There is a theory that so when there's a current theory, which that does have some scientific kind of study behind it, that when in non-autistic people, like different synapses in the brain are pruned, so that for things that you don't need anymore, because babies are born with loads of them because you need to perceive everything in the world. But as autists, we don't lose a lot of those. And it's funny because like as an autist, you kind of go, oh, that's great. I still perceive most of the things I did as a baby. Whereas like the number of studies you go, a failure to prune. I don't feel like that's a failure. I think that's kind of a just something our brains do that are different, you know. Um, so I guess and I think that's kind of important that it's a difference, because otherwise, you know, what happens is that we start talking about, you know, people start using functioning labels, which are really super unhelpful. So some would describe me as high functioning, but my daughter, who is non-speaking and needs kind of, you know, 24-hour care, as low functioning. Whereas there are definitely times when she's a whole lot better functioning than I am in terms of emotionally processing. She's just kind of out there and it's fine. Whereas I'm kind of like, you know, all of the angst of an adult. So it's in different, you know, we experience the world differently, and different autists experience the world differently on different like sliders, like Elaine described there. So it's kind of really hard to give a simple different definition, but our brains are different and we experience the world differently, and that impacts how we perceive and how we communicate, and I guess how we socialize as well.
So I've got literally a whole list of questions. I'm aware that we have a limited amount of time left, so I'm going to like some of the things that I'm really interested in, and I want you to just jump in the chat with your own questions, or which one of the things that I've got in mind you think I should be following up.
Yeah.
Because things that are occurring to me are, if you're getting 20% more sensory input all the time than a non-autistic person, I think performing is pretty full on anyway. All of the nerves, all of the things.
Yeah.
Why, if you're getting all of that extra sensory input, why would you choose to be a performer? So that's one thing that I'm really interested in.
Yeah, yeah.
I'm really interested in kind of why female autism is so often not diagnosed until later on.
Yeah.
Um, I'm also wondering if there's anybody listening to this going, everything Justine's saying is me. Wow.
If so, welcome. Join the party.
What do I do now? I'm going, yeah, what advantages? So if you've got all these things that aren't proved, what advantages it has been an artist given you as a
Yeah.
storyteller? I mean, what are you bringing in that you watch other storytellers and going, oh, well, they're not, I would do it like this, and like they're obviously not utilizing that.
Yeah.
Sal's jumping in and going, how has your diagnosis of autism helped you?
Um, so I think so. I'm going to go back and just answer the thing about why being a performer, because one of the things about autism is that we have this hyper focus, and being a performer um, allows me. So because we are taking so much information, it helps if there's structure. Yeah. So it's much easier for me to be. I am the person on stage that everyone looks at, and I kind of speak. So it is a much easier way of socially interacting. If you ever see me do a performance, I will be fine on stage. And when you ask me to speak to people afterwards, and there's loads of people, I'm just rubbish because there's so much information. So actually, sometimes it's not the amount of information; it's the clarity. And performing is actually an easy way for an autist to communicate because we're able to communicate this kind of directly to those people. The rules are super clear in a way that they are absolutely not in a social situation. So that's one of the reasons for that. Um, so yeah, just to answer your question about how my diagnosis has helped me, I think so the realization that I was autistic, so I mean, in the autistic community, self-diagnosis is completely valid because not everyone has the privilege of being able to access a diagnosis for various reasons. Realizing I was autistic, I learned nothing about myself, but what I did learn was that everyone else isn't like that. Because for years I was like, I don't understand why you don't get this. This is crystal clear. Do you know what I mean? So what I learned is that they were neurotypicals and that they had these kind of social connections and they were kind of assuming things about what I was saying that I had no idea. I mean, if you've ever watched those like what British people say and what British people mean, they terrified me, those memes, because I mean what I say. So it's just like, so it really helped to understand that there was a whole other culture. And it wasn't just people kind of completely ignoring me. It's just that their brains work very differently to mine. And I think for a lot of people, and actually having the diagnosis obviously kind of helped validate that it was useful. The diagnosis was more for other people than for me, because I kind of knew if I kept talking about being autistic, someone would go, have you got a diagnosis? So it's very much for other people, but it's nice to know it's kind of backed up.
So does that make, because I suppose we're sort of talking about the traits of being in Suffolk and but I mean one of the traits of being British that people do talk about is sort of is irony and sarcasm. And I'm
Mm.
guessing then that is really tricky if you have autism.
Yeah, so I mean, so it's really interesting because autists tend to communicate a lot online by memes, which have a lot of sarcasm in them, but it's a very direct kind of sarcasm and a very direct kind. We have a very particular kind of humor, and it's kind of, I guess, very subtle neurotypical humor that we don't get, And it's really interesting. The first time I was in entirely autistic space there's a conference every year called Autscape, which neurotypicals are welcome to come to. They just don't very often. In fact, we have a panel of neurotypicals at the end that we can ask questions to. But the first time I was just around other autists, I was like, oh my God, this is what being the neuromajority feels like. That everyone communicated the way I did. And, and it's lovely because there are clashes and then they get sorted out because our communication is so direct. Um, so yeah, it was a really kind of strange experience. It was an online experience as well. But I suddenly realized what it must be like to be the neuromajority. It's like everyone communicates so I do. There's not all these kind of like what's going on kind of thing, that we have the same cultural norms, and autistic culture is it is a different culture, And I do think, I mean, I'm curious as to kind of, I think there are some cultures because of their directness are probably more autist friendly to be in, It's because at least the communication things are kind of more socially acceptable in different cultures. I don't think Britain is, because of all our kind of I'll keep it uptight and I won't say anything is possibly the best of them.
That leads me on to a whole other thing about going back to the story at the beginning and you saying that you've always wanted to tell stories about difference.
Mm.
And there's so many conversations now about whether you should tell stories from other cultures, and that's always been that's one of the many things that's on my radar. Is I mean, I've been I know quite a lot of stories about difference of people with different needs and or blindness or deafness, and a lot of those stories traditional stories are not kind. Um, but I think there used to be a lot more of those stories, and we are losing all of our stories about disability and characters with disabilities because people are frightened to tell them.
Yeah.
And so there's the bit of me that thinks, well, okay, if things like there's an autistic community, should
Mhm.
they be telling those stories rather than us telling them, somebody like me telling them for them? But at the same time, then I'm excluding people as well. And actually those stories need to stay alive. I need to pass them on. And people need to be talked about. They need to be, if you're telling a story with everybody needs to be reflected in that story.
Yeah.
And the thing about storytelling is that you have to spell things out. You can't. I've heard storytellers say, "Oh, yeah, but if I make things really generic, then people can just imagine that the characters look like them," because they don't. They
No.
imagine that they look like the storyteller,
Yeah.
or the very generic kind of. I've been told off in the past for having beautiful princesses, and I'm going. I didn't tell you what color her hair was, I didn't tell you what her eyes were. I never said she was beautiful. I said that when the prince saw the grace of her dancing, when he saw the twinkle in her eye,
Mm.
that's when he fell for it. And I'd been very careful about how I phrased it.
Yeah.
And what they heard was, it's another flipping beautiful princess.
Yeah.
Because they're so used to it. So I do try and include stories about disability, but again, there's a whole thing of how you approach those stories
Yeah.
so that they don't get lost.
Mm.
And and how you tell them if you don't have chance, like in a space like this, to talk about them and what they mean and how to react. And obviously maybe in a school setting that's quite easy because you
Mm.
can set that up. It's not always that easy in a performance situation. And so this
Yeah.
is more of a musing than a question, but
But I think it is about, I think the important thing is that you're asking those questions and you're aware of it, that there is a community there, and that actually, particularly, I think it's kind of really important that if you're telling stories of communities that you're not actually a part of, that you're always giving respect to those characters, and you're not kind of assuming their um I mean, I think again, like I said, there's no assumptions about the wild man kind of in the story. It's like you kind of, you're seeing it, and yeah, so much of it is about respect. I think so much is about as being as respectful as you can and asking the questions and doing the research. I mean, I should say actually, so there is, and I meant to say this to you. So the book called Storytelling, I think it's Storytelling Special Needs and Disabilities, which is edited by Dr. Nicola Grove, and there was a chapter by me in there called The Autistic Storyteller. So actually, if anyone's got kind of other questions, it's worth getting hold of a copy of that. And it might answer some of your stuff, because that is about kind of it's very much about what it is to be an autistic storyteller and the challenges of that, but also the benefits, which kind of feels really important. But I think, I think particularly with the wild man, because it has a non-speaking character as its central character, and there is a general public assumption that non-speaking people don't communicate, and that's just absolutely not true. There is a whole amazing non-speaking community who a lot of them type or point at letters to communicate, and actually, a lot of it's about being respectful to them. There's kind of in the story, one of the things that's really important to me, and it's quite nuanced, not everyone gets it, is that the reason that the wild man leaves the church is because he's bored. And that's really important, because it takes it away from the idea that non-speaking means non-thinking means intellectual disability. And there's nothing wrong with having an intellectual disability, but the assumption that someone is something they're not, unless you've actually found that out, it's just rude. So for me, it's really important that he's making a conscious choice because of what he's understood of what's going on, and that feels really important. But like I say, most people don't know that. Most people will see someone non-speaking, they'll assume, the intellect of a toddler, and and you can't know that until you've given them a means to communicate, to be able to like say what they know. And actually, once a lot of people that learn to spell by pointing at letterboards or spelling to communicate have known things for a really long time, many often decades before they actually get access to that communication, and then they can tell us kind of how it was for them then. So I brought a poem by one of my favorite non-speaking advocates, which I would absolutely love to share. Have we got time?
Yes, we'll make time, I think, and I think that'd be a really lovely thing to do.
Yeah, I do that. And then I just want to kind of like I said to you before, when I asked Jess about talking about her, it's my daughter, I'd love to share kind of her not her words, but what she said. But let me just find this poem. I have a couple by him, but I'm gonna read you my favorite, which is a recent one. So Nico Boscovich, I think that's how you pronounce their name. Is an incredible non-speaking advocate who learnt to communicate by pointing at a letterboard, and you have a communication partner who holds your letterboard for you, and works as an advocate, and it's incredible. But this is a poem that he wrote for his mother on Mother's Day that he very kindly put on Facebook for all of us to enjoy. So I'm going to read this to you. It's called "For the Person Who Should Get a Gift from the Crows Every Day." Stories about my mother should start with a shot of espresso to steal the nerves, for the tale of a person who turned a new leaf at 50 and took me along for the future, bright and full of ideas on who we actually were meant to be. There would need to be a pause to pour off the tears she shed for lost loves, for those who hurt her children, for the ways she is only now understanding the ways of the world. Sometimes when we're at her house, there's a golden glow that descends on its walls. It bursts out from the lamps and swallows the air whole. There usually is music playing all day long, 3 square meals, books read at breakfast, heavy blankets to embrace me all night, fullness in simple routines that center our togetherness day in, day out. It is life at its core. Hills and valleys, fish and river, blood and bone, mother and son. My story about her will be a song I shall hum with these memories of this little house and our bright afternoons, the luminosity of these spring nights, and the joy of living so strongly in tandem while we can. It's something,
Just,
isn't it?
just beautiful. You warned me you were going to make me cry, and I
Yeah,
said it's fine, and I always do. And I think I think you should cry. I think you should show appreciation for
yeah.
the words and heart and passion.
I think as well for non-speakers, if you go onto YouTube and look up Spellers the movie, it's an hour-long, award-winning film that has been made by non-speaking adults mostly, and some children. And you actually watch people spelling in real time. And I think it's really important because if you watch those kind of people, if you saw them in the street, there's no way you would believe that those words were coming from them. But you also see how painstaking it is when you have to pick out every letter and control your body to do that. And I think that's why poetry by non-speaking people is so breathtaking, because the thought that has to go into every single letter is like, you want to get it right. If it's going to take that much effort for every letter, then every word, every syllable counts. And I think it's really important to watch people communicating that way, particularly as well when I've seen some of them. There's a guy called Ben Bro who's amazing, and I've watched him present live, and it makes you slow down because you have to sit and wait for that word and that sentence to kind of become whole. It's just an exercise in patience and slowing your heartbeat and waiting for those words. And it's always worth it.
I think that's such a beautiful place actually to bring this to a close. We
Mm.
can all now just slow down and think. Um,
Yeah, I
I
just want to share Jess's words as well. So Jess is my non-speaking daughter. And she doesn't have a reliable form of communication at the moment. But I said to her before I did this, I said, "Are you all right for me to talk about you? And is there anything you'd like me to say?" And I explained that I was going to be talking about my storytelling and about kind of non-speaking people. And she kind of listened and she looked at me and then she did. So I'm going to try and honor what she did. She went, and then she got a little bell that she has and she rung it. And then she drummed the table in front of her. And then she got her talk pad, and on her talk pad, there's a folder that says Jessica's words. And then she pressed Jessica's words. So I said to her, do you mean that your sounds and your music are your words? And she kind of smiled and pressed Jessica's words again. So Jessica would like you to know that her music and her sounds are her words.
Oh, well, thank you for asking, and please thank Jessica for, well, Jess, for sharing with
I
us as
will,
well,
yeah.
and for letting us have a little window in through you, and allowing you to talk about her.
Yeah. Yes, I'm very lucky, very privileged to share my life with such an amazing kid.
And I mean, and that's been part of the story, your story with Wild Man of Orford as well, because you first started working with that story 10 years ago,
Yeah,
weeks before you got pregnant with her.
yeah, probably. A lot, probably a lot longer than that, but yeah, it's yeah, and it's kind of yeah, it's really interesting that her journey and my journey are kind of like, my whole journey of realizing I'm autistic was kind of inspired by hers. So we're kind of, doing this dance. And she's also a mermaid. Well, basically, we always say she's a mermaid because in water, she's taught herself to swim and she swims underwater. And we kind of like to say that's why she kind of doesn't have words. She gave them up to have legs for us. So
That's also a very beautiful thought.
yeah.
So there is lots of ways of following this up because we do just have a short time. Um,
Mhm.
so you mentioned lots of links to the Spellers, the movie, and
Yeah,
the and poetry. So
yeah,
I'm going to put those up in the Facebook event.
that'd be
I'll
great.
make sure that those are there, and they'll also be on the description on the YouTube.
Yeah.
But we can also follow you as well, so we can hear you in all sorts of places. So the first opportunity being tomorrow night.
Yes, Tales and Tunes tomorrow night. So depending on how many people there, I might tell, I might not, but I always start with the story that I make up. So, that's on the World Storytelling Cafe. So you just go. It starts at 7 o'clock tomorrow. Scroll down, click the join story button, and we will be there sharing songs and stories and whatever anyone wants to, really, in front of the mic.
And have you got anything else coming up? Where else can we find you and hear you and
So
see
it kind
you?
of depends. If you're around East Anglia, I am storytelling in Felixstowe for the folk and sea shanty festival on Saturday on Hamilton Road. So just kind of look on my socials to find that. If you're in Ipswich the following weekend, I'm at Folk at the Boat, doing kind of a sort of dark love set. So there'll be music and songs there. There's other things that I can't remember, but I'll also be at Harlequin Fair, which is in North Norfolk. I will be at Prima Donna Festival, which is in Stowmarket, and I will be at Folk East as well. So if you're coming down for Folk East, then please come and look me up. So yeah, lots of places. But if you go to my Facebook page is So What's the Story? If you look that up, it's got all of the events that I often have to look it up myself to know what I'm doing. So
And if you just put Justine de Mierre storyteller into Google, you will find Justine's
yeah,
website and be able to find what's going on. But you
yeah,
don't have any recordings or books yet, do you? Apart from, but you do have the chapter in Dr. Nicola Gray's book,
yeah.
which I thoroughly recommend.
Exactly. One day I will get around to kind of making recordings or books that you guys can kind of
But that's fine. That's what you, the heart of what you do is being live.
yeah.
So that's where to find Justine. We will be back with Taking this Tradition on next month. As I said earlier, there is a whole host of previous conversations that you can find on the Taking the Tradition YouTube channel. They're all up, they're free. You can access them anytime. And thank you very much for being with us
Thank you.
tonight, whether you are listening live or if you are coming and exploring the archive in the future. It's a delight to have your company whenever and wherever you choose to join us. Thank you again to my amazing patrons who make this all possible. If you want to join them, you can go to Amy Douglas on their Patreon page, Patreon site. You'll find me very easily there. If you are on YouTube, please do subscribe, because if you press that little button, it does make us a little bit easier to find. So I'm very grateful if you can subscribe. And next month, taking the tradition on will be Tuesday again. It's usually the first Tuesday of the month. So it'll be Tuesday, the 2nd of July. And my guest then will be Giles Abbott. This isn't a series about difference, particularly. It's just the way it's coming about. So Giles Abbott is the only medically diagnosed blind storyteller in the UK. I believe he's also a voice teacher, fantastic storyteller, and will have a
Voice is
very.
amazing. Oh, I could listen to him all night.
He has got one of those chocolate voices.
Absolutely has.
Yeah, definitely. So just come and sort of bathe. You can just close your eyes and bathe in his voice. It's better if you decide to listen to what he has to say, but I do know people who just go, just let their voice flood over. So that is what is in store for next month. It'll be a very different evening, but I think we will still be talking about difference and attitudes. But also, again, the focuses that come with that and focusing on the voice and on change, which storytelling is all about. It's about journeys and it's about change. But for now, good night, good morning, good afternoon, depending where you are in the world and what time it is for you. And thank you so much, Justine, for sharing all of your thoughts and experiences, being so open and so vulnerable. And we love your directness. And thank you for helping me to take the tradition on. Good night.
Good night, everyone.